Moscow pundit sparks World War III fears with call to prepare for full-scale war in Europe. Putin to tip US into World War III if nuclear weapons come out at dangerous time. For full news please visit www.express.co.uk. As Moscow's troops have been forced to withdraw from Kherson, Russian state media has called for the Kremlin's forces to be rebuilt in order to launch an attack on the entirety of Europe. Russian propagandist Vladimir Solovyov suggested the Kremlin should mobilize a far larger army and initiate a full-scale war across all European territory. He also denied that Russia's retreat from Kherson would mean the Kremlin's objective in the war had failed, suggesting Moscow should push on with the plot to bring Ukraine into the Russian Federation. Speaking on Russian state-controlled television, Solovyov reported, "It's necessary for us to acknowledge that we need a different army. By different, I mean a larger one which is capable of covering the whole length of the front line and waging a full-scale war on European territory." He appeared to suggest the Kremlin should expand Vladimir Putin's brutal plot to annex Ukraine across the rest of Europe, likely in retaliation to Europe's staunch support for Kyiv. He added, "Nobody has got rid of our objective, demilitarization and denazification and neutral status for Ukraine." The Russian media pundit claimed the severe problems that had arisen throughout the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine should be solved with an iron fist. The Russian president has previously threatened Ukraine's European allies, often tying Europe into derogatory statements he makes about the collective West. Vladimir Putin escalated tensions with Europe by slashing the continent's supply of Russian gas, sparking a widespread energy cost crisis. He has since suggested the dire economic situation within Europe, that has been fueled by the invasion of Ukraine, is actually the product of systemic mistakes made by European political leaders. Despite his frequent criticisms of the Western world, Putin told a foreign relations conference last month that the Kremlin had no evil intentions towards Europe, instead suggesting Russia had been unfairly demonized in coverage of the war. Solovyov did acknowledge there had been a stalling of the campaign, and this had forced military leaders to make some painful decisions. This statement likely referred to the loss of Kherson, which had been the only regional capital city Russia had been able to capture after 9 months of fighting. General Sergei Surovikin, the Kremlin's commander in Ukraine, announced the plan to withdraw from Kherson during a carefully coordinated state media broadcast. The general asserted the shift in strategy was sensible, and claimed Russian forces would be able to establish strong defensive positions on the east bank of the Dnipro River. Solovyov called for the Kremlin to reopen military academies, in order to mobilize thousands more recruits for this larger army. Russian Education Minister Sergei Kravtsov announced on Wednesday that mandatory military training would return to Russian schools by September 2023. The rollout of a military program within the Russian education system marks the reprisal of a Soviet-era policy which saw children trained to handle and fire rifles as part of their mandatory schooling. The Russia Ministry of Defense has suggested at least 140 hours per academic year should be devoted to this military program, which effectively marks a bid to improve the quality of Russian conscripts. On the other hand, Vladimir Putin could force Joe Biden's America to intervene in the Ukraine war if the Kremlin deploys nuclear weapons, a retired U.S. Navy admiral warned. Russia has conducted missile exercises, with the latest one including a possible test of a new nuclear-powered torpedo in recent weeks. A nuclear strike on Ukrainian territory would plunge the world into a full-blown Third World War, retired U.S. Navy Admiral Mike Mullen said. Speaking to PBS's Amanpur program, retired U.S. Navy Admiral Mike Mullen said, "It's just a really dangerous time, quite frankly. And this war needs an end without those weapons being used. I fear greatly that actually if those weapons come out, we are pretty close to World War III and a war with Russia, no longer just Ukraine and Russia. It's the US and Russia." Despite growing internal pressure on Vladimir Putin, the retired admiral said he believes the Russian leader is going to stay in power. "The only way the war will come to an end," he said, "is through a negotiated settlement between Ukraine and Russia. I'm on that believes Putin's going to stay in power. There are people that would like to see him go. I just don't think that's going to happen," Admiral Mullen said. "Every war comes to an end. Every war typically comes to a negotiated end, and there needs to be guidelines and boundaries that gets created into which a negotiation can occur, not least of which, before Putin is so desperate that he might pull the trigger on a nuclear weapon." Russia raised the specter of a potentially deployment of nuclear weapons in recent weeks with nuclear-powered vessel exercises. The U.S. reportedly observed a cruise missile submarine modified for special operations that is able to launch unmanned underwater vehicles, including the Poseidon torpedo. Joe Biden warned Russia would be making a serious mistake should it deploy a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine in his latest warning to President Vladimir Putin against escalating the conflict. "I spent a lot of time today talking about that," Biden said when questioned about Russia's intentions. "Let me just say Russia would be making an incredibly serious mistake if it were to use a tactical nuclear weapon," the U.S. president said. "I'm not guaranteeing that it's a false flag operation yet. We don't know. It would be a serious mistake." Similarly, China's Premier Li Keqiang the irresponsibility of nuclear threats, suggesting Beijing is uncomfortable with strategic partner Russia's nuclear rhetoric. During the East Asia Summit on Sunday, Mr. Li put clear emphasis on sovereignty, on the irresponsibility of nuclear threats, the need to ensure that nuclear weapons are not used in the way that some have suggested, an unnamed U.S. official told Reuters. "I think it is also undeniable that China is probably both surprised and even a little bit embarrassed by the conduct of Russian military operations," the official added. The warning comes as Kherson residents have been celebrating the end of Russia's 8-month occupation of the southern Ukrainian city. On the other hand, Ukrainian forces have devastated a Russian base housing 500 soldiers in Kherson Oblast, according to Ukraine's General Staff of the Armed Forces. The strikes come amid reports of fierce fighting to the east of the country in the Donetsk region as well as Russian bombardments of Ukrainian positions. It has been confirmed that the defense forces hit a concentration area of the occupiers in the Kherson Oblast. In the area of the settlement of Dnipryani, a high-precision strike was carried out on a building where up to 500 occupants were located. According to its results, 2 trucks of dead invaders were taken to Tavrisk, the General Staff said in a Facebook post. It claimed that 56 more seriously wounded Russian soldiers were taken to hospital, of which 14 more died shortly after. It's a sign that despite Russian forces pulling back to the east bank of the Dnipro River, both sides are likely to continue to shell each other from across the waterway. Across the front lines, Russian forces struck Ukrainian positions. They launched more than 40 MLRS attacks, 16 airstrikes and 4 missile strikes in Zaporizhia, Cherkasy, Kharkiv and Donetsk over the last 24 hours, according to the General Staff. In Donetsk in the east, the battling forces appear to have launched localized offensives.